Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're heading over to India to check out this new bill that's causing a real stir. It's called the Immigration and Foreigners Bill of 2025.
Oh yeah, this one's a big one.
Yeah, a big one for sure.
It's basically trying to give India's entire immigration system a complete makeover.
And we are here to help you understand what's in it, why it even matters, and what the possible impacts could be.
What's really fascinating is that this isn't just an India thing. I mean, we're actually seeing a lot of countries all over the world that are doing the same thing. They're updating these old immigration laws.
Right. You have to think about it. The laws that this new bill's replacing are ancient. They're from way back in the 1920s and 40s.
I know, right?
It's a totally different world now. I mean, travel has changed so much, and don't even get me started on technology. Plus, global politics has really shifted.
Huge shifts. So this bill is basically trying to bring India's immigration system into the 21st century, you know? And if you think about the bigger picture, it really shows this tension that's happening globally. It's like countries are trying to find this perfect balance between being part of the global scene and still, protecting their own turf.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like they want to have their cake and eat it too, right?
Exactly. So can you think of any other examples of where this is happening around the world? I mean, what's really driving all of these changes?
Definitely something to think about. Okay, so let's get back to India's bill. One thing that really jumps out is how much they're focusing on national security. I mean, it's right there at the beginning, and it seems like it's a major reason for a lot of these changes.
Oh, absolutely. This bill makes it super clear. If anyone's seen as a threat to India's security, they are not getting in. And even for the people who are allowed in, the rules are way stricter now, and there's just a lot more scrutiny overall.
And it's not even just about who gets to come in, but also what happens when they're actually in India, right? This bill gives immigration officers a ton of power, including being able to arrest people without a warrant if they think someone's breaking immigration laws.
It's definitely going to be controversial. Some people will say it's totally necessary to keep the country safe, while others will think it's just giving the authorities way too much power. It really raises questions about that fine line between security and individual rights.
Now, let's get into some of the specifics about actually entering and staying in India. Obviously, you'll still need a valid passport and visa, that's a given, but it goes even further than that.
Oh, for sure.
Now, places like universities and hospitals, even nursing homes, they're all required to report any foreign nationals that are under their care to immigration.
Wow, yeah, they're keeping tabs on everyone. It's all about making sure they know exactly who's in the country and where they are at all times. And it's not just those institutions. Transportation companies are in the mix now, too. Airlines, for example, could be slapped with huge fines. We're talking like 5 lakh, which is over $6,500 USD, if they bring someone into India without the proper documents. They could even lose their vehicles.
Can you imagine, like, an airline losing a whole bus full of money because just one person's visa was expired?
Oh, man, they'd be furious.
Much about a wake-up call to double-check those documents.
Definitely a huge motivator.
Yeah.
And speaking of motivators, the penalties for breaking these immigration rules are no joke.
Yeah, it sounds like they mean business. What kind of penalties are we talking about here?
Well, it depends on what rule you break, but they can be pretty severe. The worst one: if you arrive in India without the right documents, you could end up in prison for 5 years. And on top of that, you'd still have to pay that massive 5 lakh fine, which is about $6,500 USD. It definitely shows that India is not messing around when it comes to these new rules.
It's serious stuff. And while these penalties are super strict, the government is saying that this isn't about trying to scare people away from visiting India. They're saying that it's about making sure that everyone follows the rules, especially as the country's economy grows. But how are they going to balance this strict enforcement with wanting to attract more visitors and investors?
That's a really good question. The government is saying this bill is about making the whole process smoother, more efficient and transparent. They believe that by laying out the rules clearly and being really strict about enforcing them, India will actually become a more appealing destination for legitimate visitors and businesses.
Okay, so that's the government side of the story. But we also have to consider the potential downsides, right?
100%. Critics of this bill are worried about a few things. Some say it gives the authorities way too much power, which could lead to them overstepping their boundaries and potentially abusing that power. Others are worried about all the extra paperwork and hassle it'll create for businesses. And then there's the big question of how all of this might affect human rights.
And there's one more piece of this puzzle we haven't even touched on yet, and that's dual citizenship.
Ah, yes. Now that's where things get really interesting. This bill actually outlines how dual citizens are treated based on which passport they use to enter India. It can be a little confusing, but it basically means that how you're treated under the law depends on which citizenship you decide to use at the border.
So, for example, let's say someone has both Indian and American citizenship. If they enter India using their U.S. passport, they'd be treated as an American citizen, right?
Exactly. They wouldn't be able to claim any of the rights or privileges that come with being an Indian citizen during that visit. It really shows how complicated things have become when it comes to immigration and nationality. It's not always black and white, and this bill is trying to navigate those gray areas.
So we've been going over this new immigration and foreigners bill, and there's definitely a lot to unpack. It's almost like they're trying to do this balancing act between security and economic growth.
It's a great way to put it. And finding that right balance is so important, especially for businesses that operate in India. Think about companies that hire a lot of foreign workers or those that are constantly working with international clients and partners. They're going to have to deal with a whole new level of complexity.
Right. It sounds like it could be a real pain for companies, especially smaller ones. Having to navigate all these new rules and regulations could end up being really costly and time-consuming.
Exactly. And it raises a big question. Could this bill actually discourage investment in economic growth? Will companies think twice about doing business in India if it means jumping through all these hoops? It's definitely something that policymakers will need to think about carefully.
And then there's the whole human rights issue. Critics are worried that these broad powers given to immigration officers could be misused, potentially leading to discrimination and profiling, which is a serious concern.
It definitely is. We've seen this happen in other countries where they've cracked down on immigration, and it's led to racial profiling and discrimination. Could this bill accidentally create similar problems in India? It's a valid question, and it needs to be addressed.
It just goes to show that laws and policies don't exist in isolation. They have real consequences, and it's important to think about how this will affect vulnerable people and communities.
Absolutely. Immigration is a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. There's always this back and forth between national security, economic interests, and individual rights. This bill is India's attempt to strike that balance, but it's probably not the end of the story. What are your thoughts so far?
What really stands out to me is that India's not alone in trying to figure all of this out. We're seeing these same debates happening all over the world.
You're right. The global landscape is changing so quickly, and immigration policies are struggling to keep up. I mean, just think about it. You have the rise of digital nomads, economies are becoming more interconnected than ever, and you have more and more people being displaced because of conflict and climate change. It's a lot. All these factors are forcing countries to really rethink how they approach immigration.
It feels like we're at a turning point. The old ways of thinking about borders and citizenship don't seem to work anymore. We need fresh ideas, solutions that actually work in the 21st century.
That's exactly it. This bill in India, even though it's specific to their situation, is part of this much bigger global conversation about how we deal with migration in a world that's becoming so interconnected.
So why should our listeners even care about an immigration bill in India, especially if they don't live there or have any ties to the country?
Here's why this is important, no matter where you live. This bill highlights how immigration has become a global issue. It's not just something happening over there anymore. It affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
It's about understanding that our world is connected. What happens in one country can create ripples that spread across the globe. And immigration is something that touches so many parts of our lives: economics, security, culture, even our own identities.
Exactly. And it's an issue that requires careful thought and nuanced conversation. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes, but that's what makes it so crucial to engage with these questions, to challenge our own assumptions, and to really listen to different perspectives.
It's about being informed citizens of the world. We need to understand the forces that are shaping our societies and be ready to take part in the conversations that will decide our future. So we've spent this whole episode talking about India's new immigration and foreigners bill. And it's clear that this is more than just some boring legal document, right? I mean, it really touches on issues that go way beyond India's borders.
You got it. It's like a mini version of the big global conversation about immigration in the 21st century.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second and think about the big picture. What are the key takeaways from all of this? What do we really need to remember about this bill?
Well, one of the most important things to remember is that this bill is a major change in how India deals with immigration. It's moving away from all these outdated laws, some are like 100 years old, and it's creating one streamlined system.
And this new system seems to be all about stricter rules, tighter security, and like we said before, much harsher penalties if you break the rules.
Yeah, it's sending a pretty strong message that India is serious about controlling who comes in and out of the country.
But we've also talked about how this approach has caused a lot of debate. People are worried about the government having too much power, businesses having to deal with a ton of red tape, and what all of this means for human rights.
It really comes down to this question. How do you find that sweet spot between national security, a growing economy, and individual freedom? Imagine you're the one making the policies. How would you handle all these different priorities? What compromises would you make?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And as we've seen, there's no easy answer. It's a problem a lot of countries are struggling with.
Absolutely. What's happening in India is a reflection of what's going on globally. How do we manage migration in a world that's more connected than ever, where the old rules just don't seem to apply anymore?
It's a challenge that needs some out-of-the-box thinking and a willingness to have open and honest conversations.
And that leads me to the final thought I want to leave our listeners with. As technology keeps advancing and people are moving around the world more and more, think about this. How should immigration policies adapt to balance security, economic growth, and individual rights in a world that's constantly changing?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and we want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on this bill and the future of immigration? What are your concerns? What are your hopes? Let's keep this conversation going. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into such a complex and important issue. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.